Welcome, my friend. Tonight, we begin another quiet journey into history. Before we dive in, don't forget to hit that subscribe button, drop a like, and tell us in the comments where in the world you're watching from. Your support fuels our journey through history. Vous. Now, close your eyes, take a deep breath, and let us drift back in time to the Eastern Front of World War II, where the fate of the German army would be decided not by guns or tanks alone, but by the endless, merciless cold. It was the year 1941. German forces had pushed deep into Soviet lands. They believed victory was near. They thought Moscow would soon fall. But as the autumn rains turned into icy winds, a different enemy appeared. Snow began to blanket the fields. The roads became rivers of frozen mud. Engines froze. Horses collapsed. Soldiers shivered in thin uniforms, not designed for the Russian winter. The cold was not simply a season. It was a weapon, a silent, invisible army that struck without warning and without mercy. The men marched on, step after step. Their boots cracked from frost. Their breath rose like pale smoke in the frozen air. They searched for warmth, but fires were small and supplies were short. Food froze before it could be eaten. Water turned solid in their canteens. And yet, the march continued, always further, always forward. The soldiers whispered to one another, "When will it end?" But there was no answer, only the crunch of snow beneath their weary feet. Tanks that once roared with steel fury now stood silent, trapped by ice. Oil thickened in engines, metal cracked in the bitter cold. A machine that could travel hundreds of miles was now no stronger than a statue buried in snow. The soldiers leaned against the frozen armor for shelter, but the steel was colder than stone. The nights grew longer, darkness fell quickly, and with it came silence. The world seemed to hold its breath. Inside trenches dug hastily in the ice, men curled into themselves. Some whispered prayers. Others simply closed their eyes and dreamed of warm kitchens, of families waiting far away. But the winter was endless, and the nights stretched on without mercy. Historians say the Soviet army was fierce, but it was the cold that broke the German lines first. Frostbite stole fingers and toes. Weapons froze in soldiers' hands. A rifle was useless when ice sealed its trigger. A man was powerless when his own body betrayed him. And so the tale drifts forward. One night turns into another. Snow drifts higher and higher. The wind howls without pause. Men struggle on, step after step, never reaching warmth. The winter stretches without end. And the story continues again and again and again. If you are still awake, dear listener, remember to subscribe, like, and leave a comment, so we may continue weaving these quiet stories of history. But if your eyes are heavy, let the march of the frozen army guide you into rest. For the snow is still falling, the soldiers are still walking, and this story has no end. The road stretched endlessly across the white horizon. Snow covered every landmark, every path, every memory of the land beneath. The soldiers could no longer tell where the villages once stood, or where the forests began. The world was only snow and ice and silence. Each step echoed like a drum in the stillness. But behind them, the sound was swallowed by the wind, as if their journey left no trace at all. At night, they gathered around small fires. The flames flickered weakly, shadows stretching across pale faces. Hands reached forward for warmth, but the fire was too small, the cold too great. One by one, the flames dimmed until only darkness remained, and then silence, broken only by the whisper of snow falling on their weary shoulders. Sometimes they stumbled into forests, where the trees stood like tall, frozen statues. Icicles hung from branches like glass swords. The forest creaked in the wind, as if alive, as if whispering to the men that they did not belong here. They moved between the trunks in endless lines, each step slower than the last, each breath colder than the one before. The commanders ordered them forward, always forward, no matter how deep the snow grew, No matter how heavy their bodies became, the march continued, but the road had no end. The horizon never grew closer, and the soldiers felt as though they were marching into eternity itself. Some men collapsed in the snow, too tired to rise. Their comrades tried to lift them, but the cold was stronger than their will. The snow covered their bodies slowly, as if nature itself was tucking them into a frozen bed. And the march moved on, leaving silence behind. The tanks stood like frozen beasts, engines dead, tracks buried under frost. The men leaned against them for shelter, but steel held no warmth. The soldiers closed their eyes, listening to the wind whistle through the hollow barrels of the cannons. It was as if the machines themselves were sighing in defeat. A new dawn rose, but the sun gave no heat. Its light reflected on the snow, blinding and cold. The soldiers opened their eyes to another day that felt exactly like the one before. And so the march continued, step after step, breath after breath, with no destination. The blizzards howled louder. Snow fell thicker. The cold pierced through every layer of cloth, through every wall, through every dream of home. The soldiers whispered again, "When will it end?" But the answer was always the same. Never. Night followed day. Day followed night. The cycle repeated over and over. But nothing changed. Only the snow grew deeper. Only the march grew slower. The story stretched onward like an endless road. And still, the men kept walking. The road stretched endlessly, covered in a thick white blanket. Snowflakes drifted gently from the sky, each one landing silently on the shoulders of weary men. The soldiers walked slowly, their boots sinking deep into the frozen ground. Every step felt heavier than the last, as though the earth itself was pulling them downward. The wind whispered through the empty fields, carrying with it the sound of nothing. There were no birds, no rivers, no voices, only the steady crunch of boots on snow, repeating endlessly, like the ticking of a distant clock. The men looked ahead, but the horizon never changed. It was always the same pale line, blurred between white snow and gray sky, and so they walked, as though trapped in a dream with no awakening. At night, small fires flickered in the distance, scattered across the camp like fragile stars fallen to earth. The flames glowed weakly, trembling against the icy winds. Men gathered around them, shoulders hunched, hands trembling, breath steaming in the frozen air. They stretched their palms toward the fire, desperate for warmth, but the flames gave little comfort. The cold crept in from behind, always stronger, always present. One soldier stared into the fire until his eyes grew heavy. The flames danced in his vision, blurring, softening. The crackle of wood became slower, quieter, until all that remained was silence. And as his eyes closed, the fire faded into darkness. Around him, snow fell gently, covering the embers, covering the men, covering everything. The army entered a forest. The trees stood tall, black trunks wrapped in ice, branches heavy with snow. Icicles dangled like sharp teeth, gleaming in the faint light. The forest groaned with each gust of wind, as though alive, as though watching. The path wound between the trees, narrow and endless. Every sound was swallowed by the snow. Day after day, the soldiers marched. Each sunrise looked the same as the one before. Each sunset faded into the same long, frozen night. They no longer spoke of victory. They no longer spoke of home. They simply walked, one step, then another, then another. Their bodies ached. Their fingers burned with frost. Their eyes grew hollow, staring always ahead, never behind. And the road stretched on and on and on, as though eternity itself had taken the shape of snow. Silence pressed down on the camp like a heavy blanket. At night, the men lay on the frozen ground, curled into themselves. Some whispered to the stars, asking for warmth. Others closed their eyes and drifted into dreams of summers long ago. The silence was broken only by the sound of the wind, howling softly across the empty plains. It carried with it the smell of smoke, the taste of frost, the endless voice of winter, and then The silence returned, always, without end. Morning came again, pale and weak. The sun rose, but its light carried no warmth. It painted the snow in silver and white, but the cold remained, biting into skin, into bone, into memory. The soldiers opened their eyes to another day of marching, another day of hunger, another day of endless cold. And yet they rose. They lifted their rifles, slung their packs, and began walking again, one foot, then another, always forward, always deeper into the frost. The men walked in long lines, shadows stretching across the white ground. The sun was low, pale and weak, casting thin light that glimmered on the snow. Their helmets gleamed faintly, their rifles dangled heavily at their sides. Every step left a mark, but soon the wind came, brushing the snow smooth again, erasing every trace of their passage. It was as though they had never walked there at all, as though their journey belonged only to memory, already fading even as it unfolded. The soldiers looked at one another, but said nothing. The silence was deeper than words. Night returned like a slow curtain falling across the land. The men gathered in clusters, their breath forming small clouds, their bodies trembling in the frozen dark. A few tried to light fires, but the wood was damp, and the flames sputtered before they could grow. The stars overhead burned bright, but they gave no warmth, only the reminder of distance, of how far away home had become. Some soldiers closed their eyes and dreamed of summers, fields of green, kitchens filled with bread, children's laughter echoing through open windows. But when they woke, it was always the same: snow, silence, and the endless march forward. The great engines of war stood silent. Tanks once roaring with steel power now lay frozen, their tracks buried beneath mountains of snow. The guns pointed skyward like monuments, motionless, mute. Soldiers pressed their backs against the cold steel, seeking shelter from the cutting wind. But the metal was colder than the air, stealing the warmth from their bones. In the distance, the sound of another engine failing echoed like a final breath, and then there was silence again. The wind never ceased. It whistled through abandoned villages, through shattered windows, through hollow shells of houses left behind. Carried whispers, the voices of the frozen land, a language older than any army, older than any war. The men listened, but they could not understand. The whispers told them only one thing: you will not conquer winter. Winter will conquer you. And the march continued. The horizon stretched without limit, white upon white, sky blending with earth, until the world seemed to dissolve into nothing. The soldiers stared ahead, but they could not tell where the road led. It felt as though they were walking in circles, trapped in an endless loop of snow and silence. One man stumbled, another lifted him. Together they walked on, because there was no choice but forward. And forward meant only more snow, more cold, more silence. Time itself seemed to stop. The clocks had no meaning here. Minutes felt like hours, hours felt like days. The soldiers counted steps instead of minutes. They measured time by the number of times their boots sank into the snow, and the number of times they lifted them again. Step after step, hour after hour, day after day. The march continued, without end. Morning returned once more. The pale sun rose above the horizon, casting a glow across the snow. But the warmth never came. The frost never lifted. The men opened their eyes, stared at the sky, and then rose again. They lifted their packs, tightened their belts, and took their first steps into another endless day. The sound of boots on snow echoed once more, always the same, always repeating, a song of footsteps and silence that had no final verse. The army moved across wide plains, where nothing grew, nothing moved, nothing lived except the drifting snow. The land stretched in every direction, an endless sea of white and silence. The men felt small upon that empty stage. Their lines wound forward like a fragile thread, barely visible against the vastness of the land. Step after step, their boots broke the snow, But the land swallowed the marks quickly, as though denying they had ever been there. A soldier looked back, hoping to see the path they had taken. But behind him, the plain was smooth, untouched, as if the army had never existed at all. And so they marched on, lost in a world without edges, without beginning, without end. From time to time, the soldiers came upon villages, houses with shattered roofs, windows covered in ice, doors hanging open to the cold wind. No voices, no children, no fires burning in the stoves. The soldiers entered carefully, hoping to find shelter, a corner of warmth, perhaps even a piece of bread left behind. But the houses were empty, filled only with frost, chairs covered in snow, tables broken, beds as cold as stone. They lit small fires in the ruins, but the walls let the wind through, and the warmth was gone as quickly as it came. When dawn returned, the soldiers left, the village sinking once again into silence. Another ghost swallowed by winter. The cold did not only live in the air, it lived upon the men themselves. Fingers stiffened until they could no longer bend. Skin turned pale, then blue, until it felt like stone. Faces were burned by the wind, lips cracked, eyes watered endlessly. Some soldiers wrapped cloth around their hands, others stuffed straw into their boots, but nothing stopped the creeping frost. One by one, men faltered, falling to their knees, unable to rise again. Their comrades tried to carry them, but the march demanded they move forward. The frozen men were left behind, slowly becoming part of the snow, part of the land, part of the wind. Night was not just darkness. It was a silence so deep that even breath seemed too loud. The men lay in the snow, their bodies curled tightly, sharing what little warmth they had left. Above them, the stars burned sharp and clear, but they were distant, uncaring. The only sound was the wind, sliding across the plains, slipping through broken windows, howling through the branches of frozen trees. Some soldiers whispered to each other, but their words were soft, fragile, lost quickly in the night. And when silence returned, it felt as though the entire world had fallen asleep. Forever, the march continued, boots pressing into snow, rifles hanging heavy, breath clouding in the frozen air. The sound of their steps became a rhythm, a slow, steady drumbeat that carried through the night. It echoed in the ears of the soldiers, repeating, 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 until it no longer sounded like footsteps at all, but like the heart of winter itself, beating endlessly, without rest. Dawn arrived once more, painting the snow in soft shades of gold. But the light was cruel, for it gave no heat. The men opened their eyes, saw the endless plain again, and rose once more. Their bodies were heavy, but the march called them forward. The road ahead was the same as the road behind, yet they could not stop. One soldier whispered, "Tomorrow will be better." But tomorrow was always the same, always cold, always silent. Winter stretched on, longer than memory, longer than hope. The snow fell day after day, layer upon layer, until the earth itself disappeared beneath it. The men moved slower now, but they still moved, forward, always forward, toward a horizon that never drew closer. The story of their march had no ending, only new chapters of snow and silence, of footsteps and wind, of nights and mornings repeating without mercy. And so the march continues still, as though frozen in time, as though destined never to end. The road was no longer a road. It was only a ribbon of snow, stretching across the plain, vanishing into the horizon. The soldiers walked slowly, their bodies leaning forward, their rifles heavy against their shoulders. Each step sank into the frozen ground, and each step felt heavier than the one before. The wind carried snow across their path, erasing their footprints as soon as they were made. The land itself seemed determined to forget them.
No trace.
No memory, only silence. And so the road stretched forward, forever. They came again to a village. The houses stood broken, roofs torn apart, doors hanging open. Snow had crept inside, covering the tables, filling the chairs, resting in the corners like quiet dust. The soldiers stepped inside carefully, hoping for warmth, hoping for bread, hoping for life. But the rooms were empty. The stoves were cold. The silence was deeper than words. Some men sat down, resting their heads against frozen walls. Others tried to light small fires, but the wood was brittle, and the flames died quickly. By morning, the soldiers moved on, and the village returned to silence, to snow, to memory. From afar, the army was only a shadow, a long black line crawling slowly across the white plain. Dozens, then hundreds, then thousands of men, stretching into the distance. Their heads were bowed, their movements slow, their breaths rose together, clouds drifting upward like smoke. From the sky, they looked like ants on snow, small and fragile, moving endlessly without end. They entered another forest. The trees were tall and silent, their trunks black against the snow. Branches hung low, heavy with ice, creaking with every gust of wind. The soldiers walked between the trees, their footsteps muffled, their breath echoing faintly. Some thought they heard whispers, the forest speaking to them, telling them to turn back, to stop, to rest. But the march continued, always forward, always deeper, always lost in the forest of ice. At night, the camp spread across the plain like dim stars. Small fires flickered weakly, barely holding back the dark. Men huddled around them, hands outstretched, faces pale in the glow. The flames hissed, wood cracking softly, until the fire burned low. The men leaned closer, but the flames faded, and the cold returned. One by one, the soldiers fell silent, lying down upon the snow, closing their eyes, dreaming of warmth that never came. By morning, some would rise again, and some would not. The cold grew heavier each day. It sank into boots, into coats, into skin. It pressed upon shoulders like an unseen burden. Fingers stiffened until rifles could barely be held. Faces burned with frost, eyes watering, lips splitting. The men no longer spoke. Words froze in their throats before they could be spoken. Silence became the only language, and even silence felt heavy. The sun rose once more, but the world remained unchanged. White fields, gray skies, wind that never stopped. The soldiers rose again. Their legs ached, their backs bent, but they walked. The road stretched forward, longer than memory, longer than hope, and still they walked, step after step, day after day, forever. Time dissolved into the march. There were no hours, only footsteps, no days, only nights fading into mornings, mornings fading into nights. The men forgot the names of villages. They forgot the count of days. They remembered only the rhythm of the march, the sound of boots on snow, the endless whisper of the wind. And in that rhythm, they felt themselves fading too, becoming shadows upon the plain, becoming part of the winter itself. The soldiers walked upon a path that seemed to vanish beneath their feet. Each step they took was swallowed by drifting snow, until even the trail behind them was gone. They looked back, but there was nothing, only white silence stretching to the horizon. It felt as though they were walking upon a dream where no mark was ever left, no memory ever kept. The land refused to remember them. The road refused to hold them, and so they marched forward, as if chasing a horizon that would never be reached. They marched in silence, side by side. One soldier carried his rifle across his shoulder. Another clutched his coat tightly around his chest. They did not speak, but their silence became a kind of language. A glance was enough. A nod was enough. No words were needed, for the cold swallowed every sound, every voice, every cry. And yet, despite the silence, there was comfort in their closeness, a reminder that no man walked alone, even in the endless march of snow. The fields stretched endlessly. Once they had been farmland, green, fertile, alive with crops and life. Now they were seas of snow, flat and white as far as the eye could see. Fences lay buried. Wells stood frozen. The earth itself was hidden beneath layers of ice. The soldiers passed across these fields slowly, their figures small against the vast plain. The wind moved across the open land, lifting waves of snow like an ocean without water. The fields had no beginning. The fields had no end. They were eternal. And within them, the men became eternal too, trapped in a march that would never stop. At night, they tried to gather warmth once more. Small fires burned here and there, flickering weakly, casting shadows that swayed across pale faces. The flames whispered softly, crackling like voices from another world. Men held their hands near, feeling the faintest touch of heat, but the flames always faded, always too soon. The night always won, and as the fires turned to ash, the men leaned upon one another, closing their eyes, drifting between waking and sleep. The snow fell gently upon their shoulders, as if the sky itself was tucking them into an endless rest. Tanks stood like statues, covered in frost, their tracks buried, their guns silent. Once they had been engines of war, roaring with thunder, tearing across the land. Now they were monuments to stillness, cold, motionless, forgotten. Soldiers leaned against them for shelter, but the steel was colder than the air, stealing the last warmth from their bodies. The machines seemed to sigh in the wind, as though mourning their own silence. The night grew longer, each hour stretched and stretched, until it felt as though morning would never come. The men lay in their trenches, their breaths shallow, their bodies curled tightly. Some whispered prayers, others said nothing at all. The stars watched silently, distant and cold. The moon shone faintly, a pale coin in the frozen sky, and still the night stretched onward, without end, without mercy. At last the sun rose again, but it was not a sun of warmth. It was pale, weak, its light reflecting off the snow like cold glass. The soldiers opened their eyes, looked at the horizon, and rose once more. They lifted their rifles, slung their packs, and began the march again. One foot, then the other, step after step, day after day, always forward. The horizon never drew closer. The road never ended. The march continued. The soldiers moved forward into a world without edges. The land stretched so wide, so empty, that it felt like they were walking across the surface of the sky itself. Snow fell softly, layer upon layer, blurring the lines of the horizon until earth and sky became one endless canvas of white. Every flake landed silently on their helmets, on their coats, on their rifles. The flakes melted slowly at first, but soon even the warmth of the body was not enough to resist. The snow stayed, resting upon them as if it belonged there, as if the men themselves were becoming part of the frozen land. They looked ahead, but the road offered no sign, no change, no Armies. Only the same endless whiteness, only the same silence. The march did not speed, it did not slow, continued like a heartbeat, steady, endless, unrelenting. Among the snowfields they found a church. Its roof sagged beneath the weight of ice, its bell tower silent, its doors broken. Inside, the air was colder than outside. Icicles hung from the altar. The pews were coated with frost. The windows, once filled with colored glass, were shattered, leaving jagged teeth of ice. The men sat in silence, their breaths rising in pale clouds that drifted upward, fading into the rafters. Some closed their eyes, listening to the stillness. Others stared at the cracked walls, imagining prayers once spoken here, voices long gone, echoes swallowed by winter. When they rose to leave, the church remained behind them, a hollow skeleton in the snow, the silence deeper than before. From a distance, the army appeared as endless columns, stretching across the plain in dark, wavering lines. The soldiers walked close together, their heads bent low, their rifles clutched against their chests. They moved as one, not with energy, but with weight. the weight of thousands of steps, thousands of breaths, thousands of tired hearts beating slowly against the cold. Their shadows lay long on the snow, black streaks across the white expanse. But as the day passed, the shadows shifted, then faded into the pale evening. Soon, even their outlines disappeared, leaving only the march itself, continuing forward. The wind never stopped. It blew across the plains in long sighs, curling around broken houses, sliding through the gaps in helmets and coats. To some, it sounded like voices, whispers of family names, fragments of lullabies once sung in warmer places, echoes of laughter from summers long gone. The soldiers tilted their heads, listening to the murmur of the air. For a moment they believed they heard words, but the wind carried them away quickly, leaving only the hollow moan of winter. Still the men marched, their own silence joining the whispers of the wind, until it was impossible to tell where the voices ended, and where the footsteps began. Night fell again, and the frost thickened across the land. The fires burned small, glowing faintly like stars scattered across the plain. The soldiers sat close, their faces pale in the dim light. They stretched their hands to the fire, but the flames seemed tired, barely alive. The heat reached only the skin, never the bone, never deep enough. Around them the snow fell gently, soft and slow, covering helmets, covering shoulders, covering the fires themselves. The men leaned against one another, eyes half closed, breathing together in a rhythm that matched the whisper of the wind. And slowly, the night passed, not with peace, but with silence so heavy, felt eternal. The sun returned, but it brought no warmth. It rose slowly, casting pale light across the snow, a light so sharp it hurt the eyes. The soldiers stirred, their bodies stiff, their movements heavy. One by one, they rose again. They lifted their rifles, tightened their belts, and began the march once more. The horizon was the same. The snow was the same. The cold was the same. Nothing had changed. And yet, the march continued, because there was nothing else. No end, no beginning, only the endless road of winter. The soldiers reached a river at dusk. The surface was hard as stone, a mirror of pale ice stretching far into the distance. Cracks ran through it like dark veins, groaning softly under the weight of winter. They stepped onto the ice carefully. Their boots echoed with hollow sounds, as though the river were whispering beneath them. Each step carried a question. Would the ice hold? Would it shatter? The men moved slowly, breath rising, rifles clutched tightly. Beneath their feet, they imagined the dark water, silent, endless, waiting. But the ice held, and when they reached the other side, the march began again, as if the river had never been there. Another village appeared on the horizon. Its rooftops were nearly hidden, buried beneath mountains of snow. Only chimneys and broken fences rose above the drifts. The soldiers entered the silent streets. Doors were frozen shut, windows broken, curtains stiff with frost. Inside the houses, chairs lay overturned, beds covered with sheets of ice. They searched, but there was nothing. No firewood, no food, no voices. When they left, the snow closed around the village again, erasing it from sight, as though it had never existed. The army stretched across the plain in endless rows. Men moved in silence, their bodies bent against the wind, their rifles heavy at their sides. From above, it looked like a black thread sewn across white fabric, a fragile line against an ocean of snow. Step after step, they walked. The sound of boots pressing into ice became their song, slow, steady, repeating forever. The line curved, disappeared into the horizon, and still it grew longer, stretching into infinity. The soldiers entered a frozen forest. The trees rose tall, black trunks crowned with ice, their branches heavy with snow. The wind passed through them slowly, making the branches creak, groan, whisper. To some men, it sounded like words, faint voices drifting between the trees, calling their names, offering rest. They looked around, but saw no one. Only trees, only snow, only silence. Still, the whispers followed them, step after step, deeper into the forest without end. That night, the camp spread across the snow like scattered embers. Fires glowed dimly, casting thin circles of light. Men sat around them, their faces hollow, their hands trembling. They leaned close, seeking warmth, but the flames gave little. The firelight flickered across helmets and rifles, making shadows dance like ghosts. Some soldiers closed their eyes, drifting into uneasy sleep. Others stared into the flames, watching them fade. The cold no longer touched only the skin. It sank deeper, into muscles, into bones, into the very core of the body. Every step hurt, every breath burned. Hands refused to bend, feet refused to lift. The soldiers moved like shadows, their bodies stiff, their eyes distant. The frost was no longer around them, it was inside them, and still, they walked. The sun rose once more, pale and distant, its light spilling across the white plain. The soldiers stirred, their movements slow, their faces gray. They rose one by one, lifted their rifles, tightened their belts, and began again. The march repeated. The road stretched forward. The snow whispered beneath their boots. The horizon lay flat and featureless, a straight line where sky and earth blended into one. No hills, no forests, no villages, only the same white surface that seemed to stretch into eternity. The soldiers' eyes searched for change. A tree, a stone, a road sign, but nothing appeared. Only the wind, only the snow. Time dissolved in that whiteness. Minutes felt like hours, hours like days. Every step forward felt the same as the step before. There was no past, no future, only the frozen present, endlessly repeating. Beside the road, the soldiers found horses. Once proud, once strong, now standing still in silence. Their bodies were stiff, their eyes clouded, their manes crusted with frost. Snow had gathered upon their backs, making them look like statues carved from ice. The soldiers walked past slowly, some reaching out with gloved hands to touch the lifeless animals. But the horses did not move. They belonged to the winter now, forever frozen, forever still. And as the men marched on, the horses stood behind them, watching with eyes that no longer saw. Their boots pressed deep into the snow, leaving long trails behind them. For a moment, the path seemed clear, a line of footprints stretching back across the plain. But the wind soon rose, softly, patiently, filling the prints with drifting snow. Step by step, the past disappeared. When the soldiers turned their heads, they saw nothing behind them, only untouched whiteness. It was as though they had never come, as though their journey had never begun. And so the footprints vanished, just as the men themselves would vanish, swallowed by the snow. Another forest rose before them. Its trees were coated in ice, every branch glistening like crystal. When the wind blew, the branches clinked together, 1,000 tiny bells ringing across the silent air. The soldiers walked among them slowly. The frozen branches arched overhead, forming tunnels of glass, corridors of frozen light. The sound of boots crunched softly, echoing with the crystal music. It was beautiful, but it was cold, and it never ended. That night, the men tried to build fires once more, but the wood was wet, the matches weak. The flames flickered, rose for a moment, then sank again. The men huddled close, their faces lit by faint orange light. Some reached out with trembling hands, others simply stared, eyes heavy, breath shallow. The flames could not last. Slowly, they sank into ash, leaving only smoke, then nothing. The night closed in again, and the soldiers sat in darkness, listening to the endless wind. The moon rose high above the plain, round and pale, casting silver light upon the snow. The soldiers' shadows stretched long across the ground, moving like ghosts beside them. Every step created two figures, the man and the shadow. The march continued beneath the moon, boots pressing into snow, rifles glinting faintly, breath rising like smoke. Above, the moon drifted slowly across the sky. Below, the men drifted slowly across the earth. Two endless journeys, side by side, the soldiers moved across fields that seemed endless. Snow had covered every detail of the land, every stone, every furrow, every blade of grass, until the ground was a smooth, white expanse. The wind blew gently across the surface, lifting snow in small waves that drifted over their boots. Each step sank into the icy layer, then rose again with a soft crunch. The soldiers looked ahead, hoping for a sign, a village, a tree, a hill, anything to mark progress. But the horizon remained the same, pale and empty, stretching farther than the eye could see. Step after step, they moved forward, their breath clouding the air, their bodies moving with quiet determination. They came upon a church at the edge of a frozen forest. Its roof was heavy with ice, its doors hung open, frozen in place. Inside, the cold was deeper than outside. The pews were coated in frost. The altar was a skeleton of ice and snow. The stained glass windows were shattered, their colored pieces scattered on the floor like frozen petals. The men entered quietly, listening to the silence. Some knelt, their hands clutching rifles like rosaries. Others sat on the frozen pews, feeling the weight of the cold pressing down upon them. When they left, the church returned to silence, its emptiness as eternal as the snow outside. From a distance, the army appeared as a single dark line, stretching across the plain like a shadow sewn into white fabric. Men walked side by side, boots pressing into snow, rifles clutched tightly. The wind whispered through their ranks, lifting their breath into clouds that vanished quickly. Step after step, they moved forward, their shadows elongated in the morning light, then shortened as the sun rose higher. And still the line stretched, longer than memory, longer than hope, vanishing into the horizon. Another forest appeared, its trees coated in thick ice. Branches arched overhead like frozen tunnels, their weight bending trunks toward the ground. The wind moved through them, causing the ice to clink softly, like countless tiny bells ringing in the distance. The soldiers passed through carefully. Each footstep was muffled by snow. Each breath rose and vanished quickly. The sound of ice and snow together created a rhythm, slow, steady, hypnotic, a rhythm that matched the beating of their hearts. At night, small fires were lit. The men huddled close, hands outstretched, faces pale in the flickering glow. The flames burned faintly, a small orange light against the vast dark. The heat reached their skin but not their bones, offering comfort that was temporary, fleeting. The fire whispered, crackled, then sank to ash. The men leaned back, eyes closing slowly, drifting between wakefulness and sleep. The snow fell gently upon them, covering them like a soft, cold blanket. The moon rose high above the plains, casting silver light over the endless snow. Shadows stretched long, moving slowly with each step. The soldiers' boots pressed into the frozen earth, making hollow sounds that echoed faintly. They moved as one, a steady rhythm beneath the pale moonlight. The wind whispered past their ears, carrying faint echoes of memories long forgotten. And still, the march continued, step after step, breath after breath, into the white eternity. The cold was no longer just outside, crept deeper into bodies, into muscles, into bones, a frozen weight that slowed every movement. Hands stiffened, fingers refusing to bend. Feet dragged through the snow, heavy and slow. Faces were pale, lips cracked, cheeks burned by frost. The soldiers leaned against one another, not for conversation, but for support, for warmth that was barely enough to keep them moving. Step by step, they moved forward, the frost growing heavier with each hour, yet the march never stopped. The soldiers reached a frozen river. Its surface was glassy and smooth, reflecting the pale sky above. Cracks ran through the ice, dark and thin, stretching like veins across the white. They stepped carefully, boots pressing into the frozen surface. Every step echoed softly, the sound swallowed by the vast silence around them. Beneath their feet, the ice seemed to whisper, groaning under the weight of men and equipment. For a moment they felt the river alive, but it remained cold and silent. When they reached the other side, the march began again, as though the river had never existed. A village appeared in the distance, almost hidden beneath the snow. Its rooftops sagged under the icy weight. Windows were shattered, doors hanging open to the wind. The soldiers entered quietly. Inside, frost coated every surface. Chairs, tables, beds, all frozen, untouched, abandoned. No voices, no warmth, only silence. They stayed for a short while, hoping to find something, anything, that could offer comfort. But the village gave nothing. When they left, the snow quickly covered the footprints, erasing their presence. From afar, the army looked like a single dark thread, woven across the white plains. Step by step, men moved in rhythm, boots pressed into snow, rifles clutched tightly. Breath rose into clouds that vanished quickly, carried away by the wind. The line stretched endlessly, curving, disappearing, reappearing, always forward, always the same. Another forest loomed ahead. Every tree was coated in ice, branches bending under the weight, glinting in pale sunlight like crystal. The soldiers walked slowly between the trunks, the ice clinking softly in the wind, a hypnotic music that matched the rhythm of their march. Step after step, their shadows danced with the ice. The forest seemed alive, but silent, watching them move through its frozen corridors. At night, small fires were lit again. The men huddled close, faces pale in the flickering light. The flames danced for a moment, then sank into ash. The warmth reached only the skin, never the bones. Some closed their eyes, some stared at the dying flames, and the snow fell gently around them, covering them like a soft blanket. The night seemed endless, and the wind whispered through the dark. The moon rose high, pale and cold, casting silver light across the snow. Shadows stretched long, moving slowly with each step. Boots pressed into the frozen ground, creating hollow echoes that faded into silence. Step after step, breath after breath, the soldiers moved as one. The wind whispered faint memories, but they did not stop. The march continued beneath the moon, unbroken, endless. The cold was no longer just around them, it was inside them. Fingers stiffened, refusing to bend. Feet dragged through the snow, heavy and slow. Every movement was effort, every breath a struggle. Yet the soldiers moved forward, leaning on each other, step after step, into the frozen eternity. Morning arrived pale and weak. The soldiers rose slowly, lifting rifles, tightening straps, preparing to continue. The road stretched endlessly ahead. The horizon offered no promise, no destination, only distance. Step after step, they walked, day after day, marching into the frozen silence, never stopping, never resting, never ending. They crossed wide, empty plains. Snow covered every detail of the land. No hills, no fences, no life, only smooth white. The wind lifted the snow in small waves, erasing their footprints as they went. Each step sank and rose again, a rhythm that was hypnotic, endless. The horizon stayed the same, the sky stayed the same, and still they marched forward. Another church appeared, its roof heavy with ice. Inside, frost covered every surface. The pews were frozen. The altar was a sculpture of ice and snow. The soldiers sat or knelt quietly, listening to the silence. Some closed their eyes. Others stared at the walls. When they left, the church returned to emptiness. The snow swallowed the steps behind them, erasing all traces of their presence. From a distance, the army looked like a thread of darkness, woven across white plains. Boots pressed into snow, rifles clutched tightly. Breath rose and vanished. The line stretched endlessly into the horizon. Always forward, always the same. Another frozen forest rose before them. Branches sparkled like glass. The wind made them clink softly. The soldiers passed slowly, boots crunching on snow. Step after step, breath after breath, their shadows moving in rhythm with the ice. The forest was silent, watching them. Small fires were lit at night. The men huddled close, faces pale, hands trembling. The flames sank into ash. The warmth reached only the skin, never the bones. Some closed their eyes. Some stared at the dying light. The snow fell gently, covering them like a soft blanket. The moon shone silver over the snow. Shadows stretched long. Boots pressed into the frozen earth, creating hollow echoes. Step after step, breath after breath, the soldiers moved beneath the moon, unbroken, endless. The cold sank into muscles, into bones. Hands stiffened, feet dragged. Every step was effort, yet they moved forward, leaning on each other, step after step, into the frozen eternity. Morning came pale and cold. The soldiers rose, lifting rifles, tightening straps. The road stretched endlessly ahead. The horizon offered no destination. Step after step, day after day, they marched into the frozen silence, never ending. Fields stretched endlessly. Snow erased all detail. Wind lifted the snow. Another church appeared, frozen and silent. The men entered quietly. Inside, frost-covered pews and altar. Silence was everywhere. When they left, the snow swallowed the steps. The army stretched like a thread across the plain. Boots pressed into snow. Breath rose and vanished. The line disappeared into the horizon. A frozen forest appeared. Branches clinked softly in the wind. The soldiers walked slowly, shadows moving in rhythm. Night fell. Small fires burned weakly. Men huddled close. Flames sank into ash. Snow fell gently. Dawn came pale and cold. The soldiers rose, rifles in hand. Step after step, they walked forward. The road stretched endlessly. The horizon offered nothing. The march continued, without pause, without rest, without end.